I know that over the years we've spent quite a bit of time in the Sermon on the Mount, and this is one of the verses that may be familiar, even though we have a song that goes, "This Little Light of Mine." We're not going to sing it, but maybe an idea one day. I don't know if we really have much of a song that goes with being the salt and out of the salt shaker and that kind of thing, but maybe we can work on that. But actually, we're not really going to look at this verse at all, so I'm glad that Sean introduced it, because I thought, well, maybe he could do a short sermon on this part, because maybe people were looking forward to it, because it's like, that's the one we know. But I do want to talk about salt. I want to talk about a verse that's very similar to this, and it may kind of tie into the one in Matthew chapter 5, but this one would be in Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, and this one talks about salt as well, but it's, we think sometimes the Sermon on the Mount, what's he really talking about? The salt of the earth, the light of the world. Yeah, how does that all fit in? What's that mean? I mean, he's talking obviously in symbolism, and we've got to make some kind of application, and how salt works, and how light works, and that kind of thing. So that's all good. But I guess that's kind of easy compared to what Jesus says in Mark chapter 9. So that's kind of what we want to look at today, but it may help us also with Matthew when we talk about salt. So even in the New Testament, it doesn't speak a lot about the subject of salt. The Old Testament as well doesn't really speak a lot about salt, but maybe it speaks enough that we can put some pieces of a puzzle together so we can understand a little bit more maybe what they were thinking, as opposed to saying, well, I know something about salt today. I Googled it, whatever, It's like today we may know more about salt than even they knew about salt, but what did they know about it? And what kind of stuff were they really involved in that they would be using salt on a regular basis? So this is the verse that I want to spend some time with tonight, is Mark chapter 9 and verse 49. This simply says, everyone will be salted with fire. So that's Mark 9 verse 49. And he actually goes on to say just a little bit more. And we'll look at this in a minute. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. So, when you're studying something in the Bible, sometimes it's really good to look at the context. So what's he talking about? How does this fit in? Give us a background. So we kind of search high and low. And some people say, looks like there's really no context. Some people may have the idea that Mark remembered Jesus saying this, and it's like, it was really cool when he said it, very impressionable. I thought, I really want to include it somewhere here, like in the gospel. I don't know exactly where to put it, so I think, put it there. We're just going to throw it in, out of nowhere. But I would probably say it's not really out of nowhere. I mean, there's a context, but unless you kind of think through it, maybe you think, well, what is the context? What's he really saying? So just previous to that, Jesus is kind of in the middle of a conversation with his apostles, okay? So this is not with the big crowds of people or with the religious leaders or just generally Jewish people. It's with his apostles. And so they have some issues that they're bringing up and they're wanting to talk to Jesus about. And so maybe if we talk a little bit about the context, read a little bit of context, it may help us understand a little bit more of what maybe they're getting at. So this is back in, if we're in Mark chapter 9, so beginning in verse 33. So this is the immediate context. I mean, you can't go before, because before was probably a previous day. They've already been in a different area in Galilee, and they're traveling, and now they've come to this place. So you can't go way earlier on in chapter 9, because that was a different day. So it's kind of hard to say, well, Jesus kind of said this, and he was referring to something 3.5 weeks ago. He's probably in the middle of a conversation. So this is the conversation. When they came to Capernaum, when Jesus was in the house, he asked them, so this would be the apostles, what were you arguing about on the roads? They've been traveling, now they're at Capernaum, and we kind of know what they argued about a lot. And they go on to say, but they kept quiet. They didn't say anything. Nobody offered up anything because they were maybe embarrassed. Maybe they didn't want Jesus to know. Maybe they kind of self-corrected themselves that we really shouldn't have been talking about that. Who wants to get in trouble at this point? They kept quiet because on the way they'd been arguing about who was the greatest. But sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all. So maybe point number one is we've got to humble ourselves. We've got to be willing to take the lower position. We're willing to think about others' interests and their needs and how can I help, how can I serve, not how can people help me and serve me. So my life is not all about me, it's about helping and serving and blessing others, and especially doing that in the name of Jesus. So that's number one. That's something big that I'm going to have to really think about in my life if I'm going to follow Jesus. Maybe there's going to have to be some sacrifice. There's going to have to be some changes. There's going to have to be making Jesus a higher priority in my life than what he used to be, because it's very easy to think about self more than we should. Verse 36, so Jesus took a little child and had them stand among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. So now Jesus is saying not only serving others, but now even humbling yourself to care about literally the children, the youngsters. And back in that day, for men, probably not so much thinking about children. These evidently weren't children of theirs. I'm guessing most of them were not even married at this point, maybe none of them married, so they wouldn't have had children of their own. So how many young guys in their 20s are thinking about, I'd love to have a job babysitting. Maybe I'd be a nanny or something. Children are kind of one of the last things you have on your mind. You got a lot of ambition, you got a lot of things you want to do, and, it doesn't usually include children. But Jesus is saying, caring about people and caring about children and caring about young minds and young lives and people that are impressionable and people that you can teach and train and people that maybe are in positions where they are a little vulnerable, where you want to make sure that others aren't taking advantage of them, you're protecting them, you're looking out for them, things like that. So you got to care about the little children. It's like, okay, well, there's something else. First I got to humble myself to be a servant. Now I got to humble myself and think even less of myself because I've got to be thinking about children. Verse 38, teacher, said John, we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. And do not stop him, Jesus said. No one can do a miracle in my name, can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. I tell you the truth, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to Christ will not certainly lose his reward. So, again, here they are concerned that there are other people that are teaching about Jesus. Evidently, they're teaching accurately. They're teaching what they should be teaching. But it's interesting what they said. They said he was not one of us. They didn't say he's not one of you, Jesus. They just said, they don't go to our church. They don't hang out with us. They're not one of the disciples. Who do they think they are anyway? I thought we were the only ones permitted. We were the only ones allowed. We were the only ones who were educated. We were the only ones who were spiritual. We were the only ones who should be doing anything in the name of Jesus. And Jesus said, no. You should welcome other people. You should be happy that other people are sharing Christ and teaching the truth about him. And so he's kind of saying you need to welcome them and support them too. So if you kind of get the point so far, the disciples are not having a really positive, good conversation with Jesus. There's a lot of things that they need to correct in their life. Well, since we're on a roll, let's not stop, right? Verse 42, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, so he's already talked about the children, he's already talked about others who may teach about Christ. Maybe he's including them, but it's not just little ones like children, but maybe these are young Christians, new believers, people that are just getting started, people that are still a little bit weak in their faith. But whoever causes one of these little ones to sin, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. All right, so now we got to be looking after the weaker Christians, the younger Christians, the new believers. It's not really all that I had in mind when I decided to follow Jesus. I was kind of thinking about having a position of power and authority and having some prestige and having a big name, and maybe we could get some servants that would do this kind of stuff. But you say, no, this is the kind of thing you'll be doing when you are following me. Well, he goes on to say this. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than have two hands and go into hell where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. All right, so now he's saying you've got to think about your life. So he basically covers 3 areas of life. Things that you do, that's the hands. Places you go, your feet. And things that you see or watch or focus on or seek after, your eyes. Kind of encompasses your whole life, right? What you do, where you go, and what you look at and what you see. So make sure your life is conforming to what God has called you to. Does that make sense so far? It's pretty heavy teaching, all this stuff all in a row. They're all just kind of hearing it kind of at one sitting. So now he says, which sometimes we thought just out of nowhere, he just decides to come up with this idea, that everyone will be salted with fire. Everyone will be salted with. So that means something to somebody. Maybe it's from the Old Testament. Because that's who they were. They were Jews. They were following the Old Testament, very familiar with the Old Testament. And probably one area that they would be very familiar in the Old Testament is Leviticus chapter 2. Now, they probably heard this taught when they were growing up, but it's not the first thing that comes to their mind as far as what does it say and where it's found, but look what it does say. This is talking about offering up your sacrifices. So quite often, back then, they offered up a lamb, right? Sometimes they'd offer up sheep. Sometimes they offer up goat, pigeon. There's other things that they would offer up. Sometimes they'd offer up the produce of their land, and that's kind of a situation here. So when they come to give a grain offering, so you think about grain, that's anything you grow. It's even stuff you grow for your animals. You don't say, well, I gave God my grain animal because I gave him my cow. My cow ate the grain, so he's got the grain in the cow that I gave. No, you give your grain offering. So just about everybody who shows up at some point gives a grain offering. But look what it says. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to, what does that say? All your offerings? Now, I don't know if he's just kind of saying all your grain offerings or to like all your offerings. And if they're doing that, how familiar do you think the disciples are of adding salt to your offerings? Adding salt, and what kind of offerings are these? They're offerings that are sacrificed and put on an altar with fire. So it's kind of like almost today the way we cook, right? We cook over maybe a flame or some kind of heat, but we cook, and with our food, we season it. And a lot of times, salt goes into it. So this is the way the sacrifice was going. Fire, grain offering, salt. So when Jesus said, you are going to be salted with fire, maybe they're thinking Jesus is talking about sacrifice, because that's what this is about. This is something the apostles and even Jesus himself would have been doing on a regular basis, or at least witnessing when they went down to Jerusalem, and maybe even in some of the synagogues where they were. We talk about this on Tuesday morning Bible class. Did they go down to Jerusalem every time they offered up a sacrifice, even a sin offering? Because they sin more than once a year. So they were offering up sin offerings all the time, and that was probably done locally. So offerings are happening every day at the synagogue, and maybe even at the temple for the people. So they're very familiar with what a sacrifice looks like. So this idea of being salted with fire, everyone will be salted with fire, has to do with sacrifice. So they're used to doing that physically, again, with their sin offering or their grain offering or their Passover offering, just all the types of sacrifice. But now Jesus is saying, but you need to be. Because why? Because you are the sacrifice. And you are going to be salted with fire. Everyone's going to be salted with fire. Now, is Jesus just talking to the 12? Is he talking to all the Jewish people, that everyone's going to be salted with fire? Perhaps. But maybe this is just for them to say, all of you will be salted with fire. You're going to go through this sacrifice. And what does sacrifice involve? It involves fire. It involves dying to yourself. And so this is a part of the seasoning of what they were going through. Another verse that may help a little bit, I don't know if it adds clarity or not, in Numbers chapter 18 and verse 19, talking about this covenant of salt, talks about it's an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord your God for both you and your offspring. Again, it's just describing when they are offering up their sacrifices. It's an everlasting covenant of salt. It's permanent, right? So it's something that's going to be effectual. It's not something that the people are going to have to do forever, because obviously today we don't offer up that kind of sacrifice. But when people offer sacrifice to the Lord, the ramifications, the forgiveness is continuous in their lives. So it's an everlasting covenant, especially with the people of Israel. So this is what the covenant of salt is, the sacrifice with salt. And so Jesus says that's the kind of sprinkling of salt. This is the kind of salting with fire, perhaps, that they were thinking about. Again, I'm offering this as an idea. You probably could read 10 different commentaries and they'd have 10 different ideas. So it's not really, everyone doesn't agree what this means, right? But Jesus said something, and maybe this is just a primer if you'd like to research a lot more and try to find out maybe other variations of what it could mean. But obviously it means something. And by the way, it was included. I mean, Jesus could have said that, and God, when he was inspiring or directing and leading the people to write the Bible, so specifically here Mark, to write the Gospels, again, Mark wasn't like, well, I don't know if you're really on board here, Lord, but I really want to include what Jesus said in this letter. You know, it's just so cool when he said that. And you know why it's so cool? Because I have no idea what it means. I'm just going to throw everybody off track, right? I don't think so. God allowed this, and I would even say God wanted this to be in here. So if he wants it to be in here, I'm guessing it's got to be in here for a reason, because he could have left this out and maybe answered one of the other questions that we have, right? Like, you think about all the things that God could have told us and said to us and instructed us in, and he's only given us, I mean, we think it's a lot, but it's very limited in how much he could have shared. He has a lot more things he could have said, but he gave us what was necessary, but I don't think he gave us, this chapter's not quite full enough yet. And I know, like, students never do that. You know, when you've got to write a 3-page paper that you're trying to find filler, got to fill it in, right? God's not doing that. He's telling us what we need to know and what we need to hear. Now, some of it, again, may be written more to a Jewish audience where back then they knew what was going on, and it meant a lot more to them than it does to us. But I think it's helpful for us maybe to continue looking and considering, what does this mean, this idea of the salt and how that works, that everyone will be salted with fire. But again, near the end of the chapter there, after he said that everyone would be salted with fire, salt is good. And so, you know, again, we can think of all the properties of salt and even the benefits of salt that we have today that they had back then as well. The benefits of salt, I'm thinking one of the benefits of salt is when it snows, I heard it's supposed to snow, you know, you can put salt down, you know, so it's not so icy, you know, so it melts the ice, or maybe it stops you from slipping, or being so slippery on the sidewalks. So salt is good. But if it loses its saltiness, and so I don't know if this is a philosophical question, but, you know, when, like, salt has certain properties it has to maintain, and once it loses those properties, how do you make it salty again? You don't really. You can't really make it salty again. You can, like, for instance, if you did have some salt and it was like, oh, that's not really salty enough, what would you do? Like, would you say to somebody, can you pass me the salt so I could salt the salt? Take the good salt, put it in the bad salt, and we're going to salt our salt. No, you wouldn't do that. If it's not salty anymore, like, what is it? It's like sand or just a little piece of rock. It's not good for anything, really. Now, it is good to be trampled underfoot on a snowy day. Don't know how many snowy days they had back then, but, they could put it out on the sidewalk. So what he says is it's not really good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under the foot of men. How do you make it salty again? Well, you can't. So what he's saying, hold on to the salt that you have. Make sure that you're salty. Make sure that you have this influencing factor. Make sure that you are a part of working for God in the world. Well, how do you do that? Well, you got to make sure you're still a part of the sacrificial system, not the Old Testament sacrifice, the New Testament sacrifice. So again, that's where, you can always fall back on Romans chapter 12, right? In view of God's mercy, therefore, brethren, let's offer up our bodies as a sacrifice to God, a pleasing aroma to Him. So it's our lives now is a sacrifice, that we are living for Him, and so our lives need to be filled with this salt. And so have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. So again, the idea of the salt, now he's kind of bringing in the salt and the peace maybe have something that goes together. Old Testament, salt goes on the sacrifice. Sacrifice is for what? For our sins. When our sins are forgiven, what do we have? We have peace with God. Going through this chapter, what do we not have? We don't have very much peace because I'm trying to figure out who's the greatest. We don't have very much peace because I don't really care very much about your kids. We don't have very much peace because there's some people going around talking about Jesus and they're not a part of, my little group. We don't have peace because I don't really care about the young Christians and the people that may be struggling. I don't have peace because, I've got stuff going on in my life with my hands and with my feet and with my eyes. And I'm allowing them to control me and to lead me and guide me. And sometimes it ends up being unchristian or ungodly or unholy and unrighteous things. So we don't have peace. What do we need if we're going to have peace? Sounds like we need more people that are willing to be on the altar, sacrificing ourselves so that we can live for God, live for His glory, make a difference in the world. And I guess we'd have peace if we really did that, wouldn't we? If I said, well, I'm going to put you first, I'm going to think about you, I want to serve you, I want to help you, I want to care about the young, I want to care about the weak, I want to care about, maybe people that are not even in our group, the people that are out there, maybe they're in another group. But I want to care and love about them, be concerned. And if we have that attitude, I think we would probably have more peace with each other. So maybe that would help if we have salt amongst ourselves, then we can have that same kind of peace with each other. So we're going to sing the song of Jesus, the loving shepherd. And as always, we give the invitation, if we can help you, encourage you in your Christian walk, to be a blessing. If you want to be baptized, if you have any questions about things that we talk about tonight or any other time, or if we can help you in your Christian faith, let's stand, we'll sing this song, and let us know how we can encourage you.